Are you searching for personal development, motivation, self-help, success? Jason Fung. Well, you've come to the perfect place. Hang on.
Welcome to the Expect Success Podcast, a presentation of GeorgeBollock.com with your host, George Bollock. This podcast is for all things personal development. Don't expect success, prepare for it. Please welcome your host, George Bollock.
Welcome to Expect Success at GeorgeBollock.com. Now, in addition to listening to our podcast, you can also view the video format on YouTube at GeorgeTube.com. Dr. Jason Fung is a Canadian nephrologist. He's a world-leading expert on intermittent fasting and low carb, especially for treating people with type 2 diabetes. He's written 3 best-selling health books, and he co-founded the Intensive Dietary Management program. Now, I personally have been intermittent fasting for the past couple of years. Have you ever wondered if intermittent fasting is right for you? Well, listen to Dr. Fung.
Can fasting help prevent COVID-19? Interesting new research suggests that it can play a huge role. And I'm going to cover it, and it's coming right up. There are many reasons to think that fasting might improve outcomes for COVID-19. First, it's been very clear that obesity is a huge risk factor in COVID deaths and hospitalizations. The Center for Disease Control notes that obesity increases the risk of both severe disease and hospitalization, and especially for those under the age of 65. Obesity decreases the lung capacity and makes it harder for you to breathe, so when you get a lung infection, it can take a more severe toll. And models suggest that 30.2% of the risk of hospitalization is attributable directly to obesity. So fasting can play a huge role in reducing obesity, but it might be more than that. During ancient times, fasting was considered to boost the response to infection. And it's likely due, although they didn't know it at the time, to counter-regulatory hormones. When you don't eat, insulin goes down, but other hormones go up. And one of the things that go up is the activation of the sympathetic tone and noradrenaline, which increases the blood pressure. A lot of times in infection, your blood pressure goes down, so it's important to be able to boost it, and it's one of the things that we give people in the intensive care unit to support them through these infections. Second, as you don't eat, your body shifts its metabolism from glucose to fats, and as glucose goes down, there's less glucose for other pathogens to eat. Bacteria and those sorts really get by on glucose but aren't able to metabolize fats as easily, whereas our cells have the ability to use both glucose and fats. So when you get a bacterial infection, locking away that glucose is very important. Third, during inflammation, what damages the body is not just the infectious agent, the bacteria or the virus, but the body's overreaction in some cases to it. And the ramping up of the immune system releases all these inflammatory conditions, and it's those inflammatory cascades that can actually damage us. So during fasting, the hormone cortisol goes up, and this helps control that inflammatory cascade. And it's very similar to the drug prednisone or dexamethasone, which is precisely the drug we give people in COVID-19 and sometimes in other severe infections. Also, fasting increases autophagy, and autophagy is one of the ways that the body has to clear out viruses. Viruses affect the cells, and during autophagy, those cells get targeted for destruction. The ancient Greeks had observed that when animals and humans get sick with infections, they usually spontaneously stop eating, and deduced that this so-called fasting instinct was nature's way of enhancing our host responses. So in all those ways, fasting might be very useful for the body to fight infection and decrease the damaging inflammation that sometimes comes along with it. But more specific to COVID, it's found that when the body has fasted, free fatty acids go up, and one of those fatty acids is linoleic acid. The COVID virus has a domain that binds this linoleic acid in its pockets, and after it binds, it decreases the affinity of the spike protein for ACE2. Thus, the way that the COVID virus attaches to our cells might be influenced by the fasting, and it might be less infectious or even better. And repeated fasting is known to boost certain factors like galectin-3 that improve host immunity and decrease inflammation. But it wasn't known until just recently whether or not this really played a role in protecting people from COVID. This study was just published in 2022, and it was titled Association of Periodic Fasting with Lower Severity of COVID-19 Outcomes in the SARS-CoV-2 Pre-Vaccine Era. In this study, they took patients who were in a hospital registry in Utah. There was 5,795 patients in the general population, and about 27 to 36% of those patients reported that they periodically fast on a regular basis, and most of these were for religious purposes, so they've been doing it for a very long time. And they had completed this survey to see how long they were fasting for and how often they do. They were considered regular if they fasted for more than 5 years. And when they looked at this registry, between the periods of March 2020 to February 2021, they looked to see who tested positive for COVID-19. And what they found was that they had 205 patients in this registry. 73 of them were fasting regularly, and 132 of those patients were not regular fasters, and they compared those two groups. When they divided those patients, what they found was a very marked difference in outcome. 11% of those fasters required hospitalization or death versus 28.8%, even after they adjusted for all the other variables that they could find. That is, there was less than half of the serious problems with COVID. There was no protective benefit in terms of getting the COVID. Those fasters got COVID just as often as the non-fasters, but when they got it, it seemed to be much less protective. And this was in conjunction with what we thought about fasting, which is that it had all these helpful benefits in terms of viral clearance, in terms of protection, in terms of tamping down the runaway immune system and inflammation that sometimes happens afterwards. When they looked at the endpoints separately, that is death or hospitalization, both of them were statistically significant, and this was true whether it was for older patients or younger patients, and in all different ethnic groups, you could find this protective benefit. So what we find here is that there is clear evidence, even though it's observational, that the practice of routine fasting has not only a lot of scientific reasons why it would work, but also that there is data here that suggests that in fact the effect is very, very powerful, not only for lesser levels of COVID, that is hospitalizations, but even all the way up to death. So for a practice that's been used for thousands of years, that's been considered a fasting instinct when you're sick, that has been shown to promote autophagy, which might be important for clearance of viruses, here's a simple and effective thing that you can do that might in fact protect you.
That's awesome. Now for more about Dr. Jason Fung, simply search YouTube. Dr. Fung has his own websites at idm.health and thefastingmethod.com. His bestseller book, The Complete Guide to Fasting, is available at his website or Amazon.com. And I'll definitely be sure to leave a link in the show notes. And remember, as the late great Jim Rohn used to say, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Today I've been hanging out with Dr. Jason Fung. Keep up the momentum. Subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss another episode. We'll catch you on the next show. And thanks a million for listening. See ya.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Expect Success Podcast with your host, George Ballard. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please rate, subscribe, and review. And find more great content online at georgeballard.com and on Facebook and Twitter at George Ballard. We'll catch you next time. And remember, don't just expect success, prepare for it.